Every year during Passover, my family and friends, we gather at our house and we do what's called a Seder meal. The Seder meal is a traditional meal that's been going on for thousands of years. It is most likely, almost 100% positively, the Last Supper. It was the meal that Jesus did with his disciples the night in which he was betrayed. And there's some incredibly rich and significant symbolism inside of the Seder meal. One of the things that happens in the Seder meal that I wanted to kind of teach a little bit on, because it's got some really, I think, helpful ways of looking at and understanding both the ancient pictures, the story of the Exodus, and also maybe some things that we could glean for today. The story inside of the Seder meal is the Exodus out of Egypt. It's when God comes in power to release his chosen people, the Hebrews, the Jewish people, and pull them out of the physical bondage and slavery to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, they had lived in Egypt about 430 years. The scriptures say they went out to the very day, 430 years later, to the very day, which is an interesting point. Makes you kind of wonder what day they were keeping track of for 430 years. Have some ideas about that, but I'm not going to share them now. But they were in Egypt for about 430 years. Now, not all of that time were they enslaved. The scriptures record a good chunk of that time while Joseph was in the land as the second in command of Pharaoh. They lived in the fatness of the land, in the fullness, in a land called Goshen. But a new Pharaoh arose that didn't remember Joseph and began to persecute the Jewish people. So there was a couple hundred years where they lived in persecution and in bondage, where it went from blessings of the ruler of the land that understood what God had given them to one who had forgotten the work of God and began to oppress the people of God. So God then comes in power, speaks to a guy named Moses, and he says, "Moses, I've come to you because I've heard the cry of my people, and I have come to let them go and bring them out to the mountain so they can worship me." And so the story of the Passover is the story of that, the Exodus, the release, the departure out of Egypt into the promised land, into the land that God had prepared for them. So during this Seder meal, which Jesus ultimately celebrated with his disciples, which my family and friends and Christian brothers and sisters and Jewish people all around the globe celebrated in the last couple of weeks, this Seder meal has a portion where they talk about the 10 plagues of Egypt. Because in order to let the people go, God had to declare to Pharaoh, who was hard-hearted, that he was more powerful than Pharaoh. And so he went and he did 10 different plagues, and you can read about it in Exodus, 10 different plagues upon Egypt. Now, what's interesting about that is inside the Seder meal, most traditionally, you talk about, the Nile to blood and the frogs and the hail and the lice and the boils, and you just basically say them and you move through it. But what we have done the last couple of years at our Seder meal is that we've stopped there and we've broken down each of those 10 plagues a little bit to help give some more context to what's going on in the Seder. Because when God comes and he says to Pharaoh to let my people go, and then Pharaoh won't, God begins to intentionally attack what I believe are individual gods of Egypt. Now, they could be real gods, or they could be just belief systems or structures inside of Egypt. But I believe that the scripture says that each of the 10 plagues deals with a specific god of Egypt. And so when God comes to set his people free, to ransom them, to capture them out of Egypt, he's also first dismantling a worldview. He's dismantling a cultural, religious, and social structure that they've been held in bondage to physically. And when he deconstructs that world, then the people, the children, are ready to go out into their newfound freedom. The scriptures also say that a mixed multitude of Egyptians also left with the Jewish people out of Egypt because they saw the ruin that God had brought upon the nation. But let's think about this for a moment, because when God wants to set us free from something, here in Exodus, he didn't just pull them out of Egypt. He dismantled the belief systems and the structures that was holding them in bondage. And so I thought I would just make a quick video to walk you through that teaching a little bit. It's going to be real surface level because this is a much longer teaching, but I wanted to show you what I felt like were a pretty good connection between each plague and what the gods are. Some are a lot stronger between that plague and the actual God of Egypt. There's a couple that are kind of tenuous just because, you know, it's hard to really know, and there wasn't really a God that was personified in a plague. But I'm going to walk through that a little bit and give a little bit of understanding about what was going on there in the 10 plagues. So the first plague here is in Exodus chapter 7. And it is the Nile to blood. And the scriptures say that God turned the Nile into blood. And so when God says that he turns the Nile into blood, it's important to understand that the Nile was the economy of Egypt. It was the lifeblood, the source of Egypt. Here's a map of what Egypt looks like today. And you can see this big green strip of land. This is the Nile Delta region. But as we pan further south here, we move down to the headwaters of the Nile. There's a couple of headwaters to the Nile. And that there's 400 some miles of this river that flow into Egypt from the interior of Africa. And one of the most important things that happened every year was the Nile flood. And in modern times, we've built dams or cataracts at certain spots along the Nile to protect from this. But back in the day, you know, when the Exodus was happening about 1500 BC, there were no dams to control the flood. So what would happen would be this tremendous amount of flooding on the interior of Africa would feed into these two primary rivers that would source the Nile. And they would wash in this huge flooding all of this nutrient-rich silt and soil down the Nile Delta region into Egypt. So every year, once, sometimes twice a year, there was a massive flood that would bring all of the nutrients that was needed for Egypt to produce their crops. So the Nile was the most significant piece of economic activity in Egypt. It created the environment for them to have water, for them to grow agriculture, for them to sustain their livestock. In short, the Nile Delta and the Nile River is the economy of Egypt during this time. So in Egypt, if you were an Egyptian and you wanted to have a good economy and wanted to have a productive harvest, you would go down to the Nile and you would pray to either Khnum, the god of the Nile source, or his wife, Anukit. And so these were the gods that controlled the river, and there's a bunch of stories about them and who they are. So when God is specifically turning the Nile to blood, the Nile means provision, nourishment, food, sustenance, economy. And when he turns that Nile River to blood, it is declaring something specifically to Egypt. It's telling Egypt, hey, I am your provider. I am your source of nourishment and sustenance. And he begins to shake the foundations of the economic world around the Egyptians. And I think that that's a very significant point, because one of the most important things that we trust in to take care of us is the economy. And most of us, unless we're economists or we're political or we think about those sorts of things, we don't really ever contemplate a good economy or healthy economy or what even is an economy. But it's a system by which you're able to procure and produce wealth, income, food, shelter at its basic forms. And so what God does when he begins to set his people free is he begins to shake the foundations of the economy of the nation. And this is interesting to me because quite frequently when moves of God start happening and people are more aware and more willing, unfortunately this is true, we're more willing to listen to God out of necessity than we are out of vision or connection or intimacy with him. So when economies start shaking and provision starts going scarce, people are more often willing to cry out to God. Now, that doesn't mean that their cries are genuine, but there is a part that this plays in God's plan. So he does this to Egypt. He shakes their economy. He ruins the source for all of their agriculture and for all of their economic prosperity for that season. And what's interesting to me also here is that as God destroys that source, then the magicians in Egypt, they duplicate what God did. Now, I think this is very interesting also because we have the tendency to duplicate God's provision in our own lives. Like, it's not very hard for us to duplicate what we think God would do for us. A lot of times people in America, they look around and they hear stories coming out of other countries, maybe places in Africa or Latin America or places where we've seen more miracles. And some people that have seen miracles and kind of flow in that supernatural realm, they start asking this question like, well, why do more miracles happen in other parts of the world, but really not so much in America? Well, number one, I think that's changing. Number two, the question is, well, do people in other parts of the world have more faith? And I think the answer is probably not more faith. They have less options. They have less options. In America, we can just go and create and duplicate a lot of this provision stuff. In other parts of the world, people have less options. And so when you have less options, you're more inclined to cry out to God for something. Now, I think that there's a better way to live, but this is what's happening, I think, in Egypt, is that they don't have any other options in Egypt. If the economy starts getting shaken, most of the common people need to begin to cry out. And they would be crying out to Khnum or Anukit, and they begin to realize that these are not indeed gods at all. So God begins to shake the economy. The next thing that happens is that there is a plague of frogs in Exodus 8, verses 1 through 15. And the frog goddess in Egypt was very well known, very well established god or goddess, and her name was Heket. And she is the goddess of fertility. So Heket, if you were a mom, or if you were a dad or a father, a willing, desiring father, you wanted to have a firstborn son. Your first child, you wanted to be a boy. And you would want to ensure that the goddesses would breathe favorable on your life and give you a firstborn son. Because the firstborns and the men in particular were highly prized in that culture. So they would go down and they would pray to Heket, the goddess of fertility. And she was pictured as a frog. You can maybe imagine why, because frogs are pretty numerous around the Nile Delta, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff about frogs and fertility. But frogs was about fertility. So what God does is he begins to shake the economic system of Egypt, and then he begins to talk to them about who is in control of bringing forth life. Who is in control of life? Who do you cry out to for life to grow up in your womb? And this is also about children, babies, but it's also about legacy and inheritance. Because they wanted a firstborn son, and they believed that they would get a legacy from a firstborn son better than from a firstborn daughter. I don't think that that's probably an accurate belief, but that was certainly the belief they had of the day. So what God does is he overruns the Egyptians with the fertility. So he duplicates all of the fertility, which I think is kind of a hilarious sort of, I don't know if it's ironic, but the God that they would cry out to for more life, they get inundated with more life. So what's interesting to me here is that the magicians are able to duplicate this miracle by their dark arts. And the scriptures say they duplicate it by their dark arts or their secret arts. And I think that this, in America in particular, but around the world, is something that we do all the time. There's entire industries, multi-billion-dollar industries that are built around the control of the womb, the control of the life that grows up inside of you. In America, it has been precedent in our nation that if the life that's inside of you is inconvenient or unwanted, then you are legally able to end the life that's inside of you. And that is an absolute travesty. And it's murder. But we have prayed to the goddesses of the womb for fertility, and we have put our hands in control on this for decades in America, specifically related to the womb. But this goddess also, you would pray to this goddess for the legacy that you would leave with the favored firstborn son. So God comes to begin to shake the foundations of an economic system. And then the next thing that he does to set the people free is he begins to challenge their cultural worldview and their cultural values surrounding who controls life, who is in control of the womb, and who sets the legacy and the heritage for your people. I think that we should take a hint from these first two plagues, from what God sets as priorities 1 and 2 to begin to set people free. That if you duplicate God's provision in your own life, and you're the one that controls your womb, your legacy, your heritage, then you will be duplicating God's activity in your life. And then what that brings is a trust and dependence on yourself and not on God. So when something significant begins to happen that's outside of your control, all of your history and all of your experience will be founded in your own ability to duplicate provision and to control your womb, to control life, to control the bodies of other people. And I know that that's a sensitive topic, but it's a significant topic because we need to have a godly worldview and perspective that we don't control the bodies of others, and we are not the ones that have the authority to take or to end a life in the womb. That is something that God has the authority for. And he begins to challenge it in Egypt because he wants to liberate his people from the slavery that they live in. So the next thing that happens here is that there is a plague of dust to gnats. Or the word is gnats or lice, depending on the translation, Exodus chapter 8. So this is interesting to me because what happens is that God is going to set the people free, and ultimately he's going to pull them out of Egypt across the Sinai into a place called Midian. And so here's an image of the Nile Delta, the Sinai Peninsula, and Midian. And Midian was a very well-known location in the ancient days. It's been well-known for the last 3,500 years. Midian is in today's northern portion of Saudi Arabia, in a province called Tabuk. And the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince has actually just announced not long ago a multi-trillion-dollar global rebuilding building of a city in this northern province, which is a fascinating development, that Midian is going to be rebuilt. But God was taking the people out of Egypt through the Sinai into a place called Midian. So here's another image of something that occurs quite regularly in Egypt and across the Red Sea. This is an image from NASA showing a massive dust storm that's collected in the southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula and is blowing across into Egypt. Now, this is a contemporary image, and it's a bit lower down, but it illustrates the reality or feature of Egypt that a lot of times these sandstorms, these storms of dust and wind and sand, would blow in from across the eastern desert and blow into Egypt. Now, so when God is taking the dust and animating it, turning it into lice or gnats, what I thought about was these dust storms that would come in from the east. And I thought that that was kind of significant because God was getting ready to take the children of Israel out into the eastern desert. And in Egypt, there was a god named Sopdu, and Sopdu was seen as the god of the eastern desert. And this particular image that you're looking at here is a gilt idol that was found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, the famous king at the end of the Thutmoside dynasty. But this god, Sopdu, was seen as this terrible, fearsome god of the eastern desert. And in the Sinai Peninsula region, there's a place called Serbit el Khadim, and it's in the southern portion of Sinai. And there was a grotto to the god of Sopdu that was found here. So this place, Serbit el Khadim, is an important location if you're a Bible nerd or you're an ancient, linguistic nerd, because this was the site of the oldest found script called Proto-Sinaitic language. And this is where, about 1700 BC approximately, they believe that the alphabet began to take shape. This was the first place that they see some transitional forms where the Egyptians were moving from hieroglyphics, which were pictorial depictions of objects, to writing with things that had a sound and the beginning of phonetics. So I'm just telling you that because at this spot in the eastern desert where the Jewish people were about to be led through into the wilderness, there was a grotto to the god Sopdu, the god of the eastern desert. And so when God is telling people that he's dealing with the God of the eastern desert, he's saying, look, you're going into this scary wilderness place, but there is life to be found in the wilderness. Don't fear the eastern desert. I am the God that gives life in the eastern desert. And it may be a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's interesting is that what God does in this plague is that he animates dust. He breathes into dust. We see this in Genesis 1, where God breathes into the dust of the earth. And what he's doing is he's giving life to the dust where there is no life. And here, this is when it gets exciting for me, because here, the magicians of Egypt, they try to duplicate this miracle. And they look at it because they duplicated provision, they duplicated life, womb, history, legacy, progeny, children. They duplicated that, the control. But when God starts breathing life into the dead, inanimate objects, the magicians of Egypt said, that has to be the finger of God. Think about that for a minute. If you duplicate your provision, and if you duplicate and put control of your own womb and of your history and inheritance, if you control all of that, the world will not get to see God's miraculous provision in your life. But at some point, they will. Because he will breathe life into the dead, dusty parts of you. And when God begins to breathe life into the dead parts of you, even the world that is duplicating and is in opposition to God will look up and see your life and say, that has to be God. And I just think that it's an important feature. That why would we wait to plague 3 to give a testimony to God in our lives? Why don't we let him take care of us for our provision? Why don't we let him take care of us for the bringing forth of life and the history and the heritage? So that maybe we have less dusty places that he needs to breathe into because we've been walking with him all along. It's just me. But that's plague number 3. So plague number 4, this one is the most tenuous. I kind of speed through it because it was difficult to find like a fly or a beetle. The Hebrew word wasn't super clear and there's lots of people went back and forth on what it was. But I thought this was interesting a bit later on, not specifically during the time of the Exodus. This god wasn't worshipped that much, but most certainly this god was part of the Hebrews' experience, the Jewish people's experience in Canaan. And this god is Baal or Baal. But the name is Baal. And Baal is called the Lord of the Flies. You may have seen the movie or read the book. But this particular plague, I think, is beginning to deal with what it means to be Lord or Master. Because Baal means Lord or Master. And so what God is doing here is he's saying, all right, trust me in your provision. Trust me in your life. The bringing forth of life. I will even give life to the dead, dusty parts of your heart and learn how to serve me as Lord or Master. And I think this was a perennial sticking point for Israel because they had many Baals. All throughout the history of Israel is Israel rejecting the Lord God and turning to the Baals of the land, the other lords, the other gods, the other dead, inanimate objects that they would turn to. So this is a very important moment in the life of Israel because the Lord is saying, I am the Lord. Beside me you shall have none other. And in a couple of months after this Exodus, they're going to hear God thunder from Mount Sinai, the first 10 commandment, which is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other Baals before me, no other gods before me, no other lords or masters before me. So here at this point, the magicians stop trying to duplicate this. We don't see that again. They just get the first two and throw up their hands with number 3. But here is an important moment when we begin to see what God is doing with his people. The scriptures specifically say that God made a distinction with Goshen, or with the people, on that day. At plague 4, God makes a distinction. The word distinction in Hebrew can also mean ransom, payment, release from captivity through payment. So here at the point of lordship, the Lord begins to declare to the world that he is going to deal differently with his people. When you know him as Lord, your life looks different. You are ransomed. You are set apart. The lordship of Jesus begins to impact everything that you do, and the world will see that. And that's a significant turn here in what the Lord is doing. And I love how these plagues, progress. And you can see a spiritual life of maturity and development. If you haven't walked with Jesus, or you haven't walked with the Lord for long, or you don't know him, I'm telling you, you can get on this path where you begin to discover what it's like to have him set you free from all of the 10 gods of Egypt and lead you into himself. And I love this plague 4. Goshen is ransomed. So plague number 5. This is when the livestock gets struck dead. Now, livestock were a very important part, a ceremonial and agrarian part of Egypt. So they were both used as food, and they were also part of the ceremonial worship rituals in Egypt. One of their chief gods was a god named Apis. And you can kind of see Apis here in this picture. This is a picture that I took in New York City at the museum there. And this is the ancient bull god Apis. And you can see he's a guy, and he's got these strong horns that are shaped in the shape of a crescent moon. And so Apis is an interesting character because one of the ways that Apis was worshipped is that Egyptian men were seeking dominance over this wild bull. And so they would get put solo, one-on-one with a bull in a ring, and they would challenge the bull. And they would goad the bull on and do things to the bull physically that would enrage them, and they would try to attack the man that was in the ring. Well, in this Egyptian worship ritual, the man would try and best the bull with his bare hands, and then kill the bull, and then ultimately, on some accounts, the man would then cut out the heart of the animal and take a bite of the heart, or sometimes the stomach. Some of the sources I read talked about that as well. But they would eat a piece of the inside of the animal, and it would be like a transfer of this animal power of the bull, and ultimately the bull god, into the person that had conquered the animal. So this is one of the ways they worshipped. And that's interesting to me because you see that throughout human history. There's lots of rituals. Even today, I live in Texas, and we've got a really famous rodeo that happens every year in Texas. And the rodeo is filled with lots of sport that all grow up from ranching and cattle. But there's one sport in the rodeo that doesn't have its roots in ranching and cattle, and that is bull riding. And that's when a single solitary guy, usually the women are doing it too, but they get on a bull and they try and best the bull. Now, they don't kill the bull like they do in some of the running of the bulls over in Spain and some of those other rituals, but it's the same kind of thing. It's an interesting sort of side note. So don't suppose that because these worship rituals were going on 4,000 years ago in Egypt, that they're old and antiquated and they've been done away with. There's a lot of practices that are continuing on to this day that have the origins thousands of years ago. So Apis had a cohort, a companion. Someone called her a wife, but that's a very generous term, if you know what I mean. And Apis's female representation was a goddess named Hathor. And she was a female goddess, often represented as a cow. So the male had the horns and the female was this cow. And one of the ways that during festivals Apis and Hathor would be worshipped is that people would gather together around an image of Apis or Hathor, oftentimes Hathor as the goddess, and they would gather around, they would have a singular image they would place up on a pedestal, and then they would carve images around the base of the pedestal, and then they would all engage in libations and what I consider to be inappropriate physical activities. So it was essentially a drunken orgy. And that was the worship ritual of this goddess, Hathor. Now, while I was researching all of this, I found a lot of stuff on the internet, and, internet trolls, if you're watching this, you may start, commenting here now in the feed at this point in the video, but there was a lot of people that were continually worshiping this goddess Hathor. There was like a whole little corner of the web that was built to the worship of this goddess, and they'll probably object to my rudimentary retelling of the Hathor narrative. But this is what was going on. And scripturally, this is also interesting because if you fast forward a couple of months, at the exact moment at Mount Sinai when God is giving the covenant to the people, to the children of Israel, and he's saying, I am your God, you are my people, I have brought you out, I'm giving you safety, security, I'm elevating you from slaves to priests and kings, I'm giving you this whole thing. At that very moment, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, all the people were hanging out with Aaron, and they decided that they wanted to worship Hathor the way they had in Egypt. Because Aaron was gone or Moses was gone for such a long time. This is how they worshiped. They were lonely, and they wanted themselves a little Hathor worship. So what they did was they constructed, in classic Egyptian style, the scriptures are very clear about this, they constructed a golden image. And then the Hebrew says that Aaron used an engraving tool to make the golden image. Now that engraving tool didn't create the molten golden calf. What they did was create a golden calf, a single calf from all of their wedding rings and their jewelry. They set it on top of a stone, and then they carved using the engraving tool that's referenced in the Hebrew to carve out the different pictures of bull gods and goddesses around the mountain. Now, this was a classic Egyptian style. Now, I'm going to show you this. It's got a lot of context that I won't get into, but this is a picture of a shrine at the base of what many people think is Mount Sinai. And you can see carved all around this in the northern portion of Saudi Arabia are Apis and Hathor images. Now, this is in an area that has never ever in the history of humanity that we know of had any cattle, any ranching or cattle raising going on. It's in a very arid desert portion. So why in the northern portion of Saudi Arabia at the base of what could really well be the real Mount Sinai, why is there a shrine that's got a nice flat top with carved images of all the gods and goddesses of Egypt perfectly in line with Exodus? I think there's a bigger story here. And this is part of a teaching that fits into a larger story about Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. But I won't get into that now, but I would encourage you to look that up. So what happens here is that when God strikes the livestock dead, he's dealing a blow to the ceremonial worship, and he's beginning to deal with the sexual ethic in Egypt. And this is significant, and it comes on the heels of lordship or master. Because when the Lord becomes your master, he wants to give you a different sexual ethic. The sexual ethic of our culture today leads to death. And it's not about being a prude, and it's not about enjoying, like giving up your right to enjoy the beautiful thing that God made in sexuality. But our culture idolizes, and idols crush the life that's in anything. And when we make an idol out of something God made, we destroy it. And our culture has made an idol out of sexuality, and it fundamentally destroys the beautiful thing that God created. So when he comes to liberate his children out of Egypt, he says, look, I'm going to be your Lord, and I need you to understand that your cultural sexual ethic will give you death. It will lead you to death. And the Hebrews get a very painful lesson of this in Mount Sinai, not a couple of months after. So God's message to the Hebrews, to the Jewish people, is Egypt, I detest your sexual practices and drunken worship rituals. And Israel, worship me. This worship using temple prostitution and sexuality is detestable in the Lord's sight. That's a strong word, detestable. But the history of Israel, all the way through the days of Jesus, into the time of Paul, into, I think, today, with the tremendous amount of sex trafficking that goes on, we are still worshiping at the cult of temple prostitutes, at the cult of sexuality, and it is destroying everything it touches. But God came to Egypt to liberate the people from that practice, and I pray that he would liberate you if you're embroiled in it. Goshen is ransomed from this. There's a way to live free, untouched by this. And let me tell you, it doesn't mean that you won't enjoy the bountiful benefits of godly sexuality, but it will mean that you're no longer immersed and enslaved by something that gives birth to death.